Yep. Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Giese, and I'm going to give you a little brief program that the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation has established, probably half a dozen years ago or so. And it is called the Whitebark Pine Friendly Ski Area Certification Program. And the main idea behind this program is to educate people, resort staff and the public. You're capturing people where they're recreating, and they in a lot of places are recreating right amongst our lovely 5-needle high elevation pines. So the certification process, we have a checklist that's available on our website, as well as a brochure that explains the program. The idea is to educate resort folks, staff, and field crews, as well as the public. It also has some conservation measures and some management measures. So the idea is to encourage ski areas to embrace whitebark pine, limber pine, whatever the high elevation species is, educate folks, participate in management. They're a great place to do some management because it's easy access. Oftentimes resorts will allow us to use their lifts to get up to the mountain to do some work on trees. There's a number of plus trees in a number of ski areas. So it's really lends itself to being very handy for access to some of these important trees. So we only have a handful of ski areas certified at this time, but a number of them are working towards certification. So it's kind of a snowball effect, if you will. Hopefully we're going to get more and more involved and spread the word. And another purpose of as always, is to remind people about the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation and that we're available. We're a resource for information, education, presentations, a number of different things. So that's all I have. If there's any questions, I'd sure be glad to answer.
Great. Thank you, Mike, for the update.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of the High Elevation 5-Needle White Pine Science and Management webinar series. My name is Tia Rotu, and I'm a master's student at Montana State University in Bozeman, co-organizing this webinar series with Laurel Sindewald from University of Colorado, Denver, and Vlad Kovalenko from University of Montana. If you missed any previous webinars and would like to watch them, you can find recordings of all webinars on the Whitebark Flicks YouTube channel, which the link for is now in the chat. For today's webinar, we'll have two speakers. Our first speaker is Cyndi Smith, who worked for Parks Canada from 1980 until her retirement in 2012. During her long career, Cyndi worked in 1 National Historic Site and 5 national parks across Western and Northern Canada in roles as diverse as interpretation, law enforcement, backcountry patrol, and resource management. Cyndi studied wildlife biology at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, the University of Waterloo, and Simon Fraser University. She has been involved in whitebark and limber pine research, restoration, and monitoring since 2001, when she moved to Waterton Lakes National Park. Cyndi was a member of the Alberta Species at Risk Recovery Team for both whitebark and limber pine, and has served on the board of directors of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation from 2003 to 2018. Cyndi continues to help on various committees, including volunteering on whitebark and limber pine projects with Parks Canada. Our second speaker is Brenda Shepherd, who is a conservation biologist for Jasper National Park. Brenda leads a small team of biologists who carry out their long-term ecological monitoring program and endangered species recovery. Her background is with birds, and she was drawn to whitebark pine in 2003 when Cyndi led a project to install whitebark and limber pine monitoring plots across the Canadian Rocky Mountain National Parks. Brenda continues to lead the monitoring of these plots every 5 years. So if you have any questions during Cyndi and Brenda's talk, you're welcome to type them in the chat box and I will read them aloud at the very end. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Cyndi and Brenda.
Okay, let's see if I can bring this back up again properly. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Teo, for that. I was happy to see that Bob Keane wasn't giving the little introduction, because who knows where he would have gone off on a tangent or something. So, yeah, and thanks for inviting us. And I'll do the first part, and then Brenda will take over. So we're going to talk a little bit about the range of whitebark and limber pine, some of the threats facing it, and a short history of white pine blister rust, and a chronology of the inventory, research, monitoring, and other activities we're undertaking in Canada, with an emphasis on the national parks. And so Brenda will then take over and describe those activities, what the current work is that's being done. So both species are at the northern limit of their range in Canada. Whitebark pine is in blue, and limber pine is in red. Let's see, Brenda is up in this area. I'm down in Canmore near Banff National Park. So you can see most of the limber pine, of which there's only about 10% of the overall range in Canada, is in Alberta. There's a little bit in BC in the Columbia Trench. And majority of that is on provincial lands in Alberta, with a little bit in Waterton and Banff Waterton Lakes and Banff National Parks. Whereas majority of the whitebark pine in Canada, which is slightly more than half of the total range, is in British Columbia. And again, all of our what we call the 7 mountain national parks have whitebark pine, but the majority of the acreage of whitebark pine is actually on provincial British Columbia Crown lands, and some in Alberta as well in that case. And this northern limit could be important under climate change, and there have been some studies looking at the latitude and could whitebark pine advance northward to accommodate changes in climate. And these range maps and the shape files are available at whitebarkfound.org, and I think they're pretty accurate. They're probably might be getting a little bit dated now, but are still, I think, the best that's out there. I always like to talk a bit about the difference between whitebark and limber pine, because as you can see from that map, there are places where the two species overlap, and particularly in southern Alberta into Montana. And you can get, there's generally an elevational difference with whitebark pine, generally, like 1900 meters and above, and limber pine below 1600 meters, but that leaves a few hundred meters there where there are actually opportunities to overlap depending on, aspect and microclimates. So pollen cones are the easiest way to tell the two species apart. Limber pine have yellowish pollen cones, and whitebark have purplish ones. And you can see this one in the middle is actually limber pine. As they get older, they get a little brown. As these ones get older, they get a little browner. So you can start to get some overlap. And the size of the needles, you would think, oh, that's important, but that doesn't really hold very well. The cones, if you're lucky enough to have cones either on the tree or more likely on the ground, you'll notice the difference between whitebark and limber pine. Because whitebark pine doesn't open, the cones do not open on the tree, they're hammered apart by nutcrackers. So what you find at the base of a tree are bits and pieces. The core of the cone, cone scales, and this is what a mature whitebark pine cone looks like. And then limber pine, on the other hand, opens on the tree. And as a result, the seeds are either released or the birds can get them more easily, and they don't end up breaking the cones apart quite as much. And these green cones are the younger cones, and this is a mature cone that's opened and released seeds. And then the cone scales are different as well. Whitebark are wider and shorter, and limber pine are narrower and longer. So I think it's good to keep these in mind if you're out in areas where both species can occur. I'll just mention briefly ecological roles, because I suspect most people on the call today are well aware of that, but they both retain snowpack at higher elevations. The photo upper right is in Waterton Lakes National Park, and sure, it's the lee slope, so it would get drifts anyway, but the trees are helping to hold that snow much longer. And on the bottom right, they're Kickstarter species after fire, avalanche, and other type of disturbances, and at tree line. And of course, they're food source for many species. So why are we worried? Briefly, it's introduced white pine blister rust, which you can see the cankers on the right, which when they girdle the tree, the stem, the upper, anything above that is deprived of nutrients and dies, and you get the red tops to the trees. And then as a result, particularly with whitebark pine, there's no more productivity because the cones are found at the top of the tree. Limber pine are a little bit different because they can have cones throughout the canopy, even on the branches near the ground. Mountain pine beetle, here's a picture of larvae and the adult. Most people are familiar with it. And fire suppression, which we've been good at for over 100 years now. And all of these are interacting in times, and they're also being impacted by climate change. So mountain pine beetle are now, instead of a 2-year cycle at higher elevation, it's an annual cycle from egg to beetle. And fire suppression has allowed more shade-tolerant species like Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir to grow in those areas. But of course, under climate change too, we're starting to get some pretty big wildfires, which can be quite severe and can take out the pines. So a very short history of whitebark pine, because Vancouver, British Columbia was the West Coast introduction site in North America around 1910. And then it's rapidly spread east and south, and then kind of north up through the Rockies and up through the coast mountains as well. It was first detected in southwestern Alberta on limber pine, 1952, whitebark pine, 1958. So it took about 40, 50 years for it to spread across that area. And partly that was likely aided by the fact that the westerly winds helped carry those spores. Pardon me while I have a cold, so I'll be sniffling a little bit here. So I wanted to give a little chronology of whitebark pine and limber pine research and activities in Canada, because I think perhaps a lot of people on the call aren't that familiar with it. Some of the early years were, starting even in the 60s, but through the 80s in particular, looking at just the basic distribution. Where do these species grow? Especially whitebark pine was worked on earlier. Basic ecology, provincial inventories in the national parks, and then starting to get some of the research like David Langer with pine beetles in limber pine in particular he started with. And then, carrying on into the 90s, Ogilvy did more on distribution ecology. At this point, I want to say, I almost didn't put that in there because I don't want anyone using the map from Ogilvy 1990. It shows a big blob of whitebark pine in British Columbia and Alberta, which has really little resemblance to reality. And please, if you're going to use a map showing the full range, go to the Whitebark Pine Foundation website and get those shape files and use those, because that's much more accurate reflection. Kate Kendall from Glacier Park really started us in Alberta on looking at the white pine blister rust connection with both whitebark and limber pine, got into some of the genetics and more looking at the vegetation communities around whitebark pine in the provincial areas in Alberta. Some of the early research, starting mostly in the 2000s on limber pine. Elizabeth Campbell did quite a lot of work with mountain pine beetle, white pine blister rust, the severity of those two agents on whitebark pine in particular. They started looking at post-fire succession, how is whitebark pine coming back after fires. I want to give a shout out to Jody Krakowski, who's been involved now for like 20 years in whitebark pine and is a real going concern in moving the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation Canada program of restoration along. And I think Brenda will probably mention a bit about that. And then the national parks, we kind of got into a major way in early 2000. Ewan Stewart Smith and Brendan Wilson wrote a conservation plan in, well, 20 years ago. Fortunately, it was never officially adopted, but it did provide a groundwork for those of us who wanted to move the program forward and were concerned about these two species. Our first workshop was in 2003, and we looked at, we had, Diana Tombach came up to help us with that, and Anna Schodel as well. And, so we identified some of the research, monitoring, restoration goals. Starting in 2003 was the monitoring program looking at mortality and incidents. And by the way, the dates in parentheses are the publication date of reports or papers. And that's the program that Brenda has carried on. And this was actually piloting the blister rust methods that were developed by people for the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. So Diana Tombach, Bob Keane, Melissa Jenkins, and some other forest pathologists that had started it. And we were the first ones to kind of pilot it on the ground and see where things needed to be changed. I'd like to take credit for the first science meeting that the foundation held. In 2004, I offered to host the annual board meeting and field trip. And a couple of grad students who actually were going to university in Tennessee and were doing their research on whitebark pine in Montana emailed and said, look, is there any way we can give a talk or else we can't attend? There's no way they would be covered. And so I said, sure, we'll put something together. And we put together a couple of hours of talks with Diana and Bob in particular jumping in. And then that was so well received that it has become, as you know, an annual event that is widely anticipated and attended for networking and just for the latest science that's being done. Early on, we also did some limber pine experiments in looking at seeds and seedlings survival in a burned area in Waterton. And the transboundary help has been critical. So the seedlings, those limber pine seeds and seedlings and whitebark pine later initially came from Glacier National Park because of the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. We were able to move seeds and seedlings back and forth with a bit of bureaucratic problems with the border people, but got that usually sorted out. And so that's been critical. We're within the same seed transfer zones, and they were ahead of us in terms of where they were at in terms of collecting seed and growing out seedlings. Early rust screening of seed has been done in Dorena with Rich Sneesko and at the Coeur d'Alene Nursery with Mary Frances Mihalovich. Again, that early work with Mary Frances was through our connection with Glacier, and Mary Frances actually said, you know, you're the only people that send me Krumholtz plus tree seeds. And that's what we have, particularly for limber pine. We have a lot of Krumholtz. So, you work with what you have. I mentioned the networking at foundation meetings, and there's been a couple of high five symposia. And then in 2009, Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation Canada was formed as a sister organization to the main organization based in Montana, and they've really taken off and doing some great work. And you can find their information on the web as well. So then this sort of kickstarted more research. Randy Moody, you may know of him. He's been on the board of directors, and he's also a major mover behind Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation Canada. Some climate change work modeling all conifers from UBC. Sally Aitken, who's also she's the forest geneticist at UBC. She's had a number of students such as Jody Krakowski, Andy Bauer, and others looking at genetics, cold hardiness, seed transfer guidelines. Adrian Leslie looked at collecting seed. When should you do it? When you've got this cones caged, how soon can you go in and remove those cones? Looking at an eye to the weather, and but yet are those seeds going to be able to germinate well? And of course, this is a picture of seedlings that have showing the nutcracker caching of multiple stems. Lots of inventory and mapping has been done because, of course, if you don't know where it is, it's hard to protect it. So quite a bit of that has gotten into remote sensing and GIS. The Smith and McDermott is not me. That was a student at the University of Calgary. It's been more on the Rockies range, Crown of the Continent. Melissa Jenkins has led a lot of work with that group. And then more recently, implementation mapping in British Columbia, filling in some gaps there. And then, of course, all of this, once you know where that's at, leads to more research up the northern edge of its range. Rich Hunt had done a lot of work with various white pines, ribes, blister rust, looking at storage and germination, climate history. Of course, much of the climate history and disturbance dynamics are based on dendrochronology. So here's a core of a whitebark pine to age the tree, and work that's underway. And I hope I hadn't missed any of the recent papers. I'm getting a little bit out of touch on that right now. And then, of course, there's the wildlife connections that we all know about. There's been looking at grizzly bear use of squirrel middens in Canada, and we don't have quite as many large contiguous stands of whitebark pine or limber pine that the bears can get attracted to, like say in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but they're still being shown to be used. Grizzlies getting the cones and seeds out of the squirrel middens. There's been some work on the genetic structure of nutcrackers, and Vern Peters has done a number of papers around limber pine, particularly of predation and growth of seedlings. On the ground, once we got some of the research and monitoring, then moving into restoration. So both in Alberta and British Columbia, seed centers are storing seed. They're experimenting with germination and growing seedlings. And Brenda will talk more about that. We first started using verbenone and greenleaf volatiles to protect the plus trees starting in about 2006 in Waterton. There's been more recent research on that as well. Excuse me. And Palmer and Larson did a paper on, should we move whitebark pine further north to, like I said, accommodate climate change. But of course, one of the issues there is how do you move the birds along with those pines so that they will be there to do the seed dispersal. One of the fun things that we got involved in was with Kathy Cripps from Montana State University in Bozeman, looking at the role of fungi. Did quite a bit of experimental work in Waterton. On the right here, can show when Kathy is inoculating these whitebark pine seedlings with a slurry of fungi spores. And then in this picture, these smaller, whiter dots lower down, that's all the fungi starting to grow in that she had inoculated. So it's showing successful uptake of the fungi, and there's been shown to be some increased survival and growth, because in an area where maybe you've lost predominantly all of your whitebark pine, have you also lost the ectomycorrhizal fungi that normally have that symbiotic relationship and are important for good conifer growth? And in many cases, that is no longer there. So still doing some work on that, more work on the verbenone. Species at risk. Again, it's a bit unusual that mostly in Canada, the federal government ends up listing a species and then the provinces kind of tag along or adopt that. But it's the other way around for whitebark and limber pine. And we made good connections early, starting in about 2004, and produced status reports for both whitebark pine and limber pine. The unfortunate part is there's no standalone provincial legislation on species at risk in Alberta or British Columbia. So in Alberta, they were legally listed under the Wildlife Act as endangered, both species. But what that meant was it's more just an educational tool and a thou shalt not, because there are no regulations under that act to penalize anybody for maybe cutting down whitebark or limber pine, or in other ways destroying their habitat. There have been a series of recovery plans for both species. British Columbia, like I said, doesn't have a Species at Risk Act and hasn't actually done status reports, but they are working on an implementation plan for whitebark that builds on the work federally and in Alberta. So federally, COSEWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, assessed both species as endangered, whitebark pine in 2010, limber pine in 2014. Legal listing under the Species at Risk Act and regulations occurred in 2012 for whitebark pine, and they are listed in Canada as endangered. So there are regulations there that can be used. And for whatever reason, and I've never had a good explanation from anyone, limber pine is still not listed, which I find interesting because limber pine isn't really commercially valuable, and I'm not sure why. The whitebark pine recovery strategy is only a draft, but they are moving forward with action plans, and Brenda can speak more to that or can answer any questions, because the national parks have created these multi-species plans. And just to link back to what Mike said in the introduction about the ski areas, one of the big cases that got a lot of attention a few years ago was when the ski area at Lake Louise cut down whitebark pine, endangered whitebark pine, and were charged for it. And they ski area pled not guilty, went to trial, and were found guilty by a trial, and they were assessed a very large penalty, over $1 million. They'd cut down, I think it was 44 individual trees of various ages, and the penalty was kind of assessed on a dollar amount per tree. And that money has gone into an environmental damages fund, and that money hopefully will be coming back to do restoration work. And it's unfortunate it went that way, because Skiing Louise had some interest in whitebark pine, but somehow that didn't get down to the people on the ground who did that clearing of a new run joining two other ski runs. And I think Mike could always correct or put it in the chat, but I think there's been more discussions with Skiing Louise since then, and they've done monitoring work. There's been a number of penalties or actions they have to do related to that guilty assessment. So that's just a little aside on Species at Risk Act. So I'll turn it over to Brenda now for getting into more detail on the monitoring and restoration.
Hi, Cyndi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I will take over, and these are the two parts that I will cover in my part. First is I'll give a report on the condition of the plots that were originally set up in 2003, and then I'm going to talk about a recipe for restoration. And I'll briefly talk big picture, but then what I really want to talk about is how we've implemented this on the land base in Jasper, just to give you a sense of what that looks like. Next slide. Cyndi, you're, I think, moving my slides for me.
Yes, and it should have moved, but it didn't do so.
It didn't, no.
Ah, there we go.
There, thank you. Okay, so this is a map showing all of the plots in Canada. And back in 2003, when we started, the plots were along the Rocky Mountains, from Waterton up to North Jasper, and I think into Wilmore that early. But since that time, they have expanded westward and also include whitebark pine in the Coast Mountains. So lots of different partners installing plots now. All the data is recorded in one place, and we're working on doing the analysis all together. So that's the location of our plots. Next slide. And as Cyndi mentioned, we're following the foundation field methods from, I think it's 2005. That's the year of the publication. And these are permanently marked plots, 50 meters by 10 meters. And each of the trees is tagged. So we go back every 5 years and we assess each tree for blister rust and mountain pine beetle, and use a very standardized approach on each visit. And because they're 5 years apart, you've got to train a whole group of new folks generally each time, and that training is really critical to data quality. Next slide. So the last analysis that we did is based on the 2014 data. We're still chugging away on the 2019. But infection rates in Canada are about, on average, 50%, but huge amount of variation. Down near Waterton and in southeast BC, we see infection rates of 100%. All of the trees are infected, if not dead. But then as you move north and up into Banff and the Columbia Icefields area, quite low infection rates, down near 10 to 20%. Then they rise a little bit in Jasper and decline in the very far north. And then out in the coast mountains, what we're seeing initially is that it's much lower rates of infection. So highly variable, blister rust everywhere in every plot. I don't think there's a plot that doesn't have rust. So this data is being used to help make decisions about restoration, where because we have such a wide distribution of plots, we're able to use this data to help inform the types of restoration action to take and where. Next slide. So I mentioned that I'll talk big scale about restoration first, and then I'll get down into what that looks like on the land. So in Canada, we've been using something called conservation standards, and it's a framework for conservation that's used globally for different problems. We started this in 2017, 2018, where a bunch of different partners from different organizations involved in five needle pine got together to try and implement this framework with the key goal of trying to focus really on key targets, key changes that we wanted to see, and be able to measure our progress over time. So this work is being led by the Foundation in Canada, lots of participation by the provinces and partners in national parks. Next slide.
Okay.
Just
Strange why. Strange why sometimes it'll go and sometimes it will not.
Yeah. Anyway, one of the first, as part of conservation standards, which I would really encourage you to have a look at their website, just because it's been such a successful approach to many difficult conservation problems, is to determine the scope. And so we decided early on to adopt the scope of the Canadian range to try and bring everyone to the table. So you can see here on the right is limber pine range in red, similar to what Cyndi showed, and then whitebark on the left. And then you can see the big national parks and provincial parks in green. So that was the scope for the restoration. And next slide. And I'm not expecting you to read this, but this gives you a flavor of what conservation standards does. So one of our targets was to really increase the frequency of trees with resistance to rust. And on the far left, you see the big circle. So increase the frequency of trees, and we want to get over to the endpoint on the far right, self-sustaining populations. But what's really key is that this approach forces you to identify the steps that you need to take along the way to get there. And it also, importantly, forces you not to get distracted by really shiny things. So that's the approach that we've taken across the range in Canada. And now, next slide, I'll focus more on what restoration action looks like on the ground and how an organization like One National Park would make that happen in reality. So step one, as many of you know, is to find resistant trees, and what's necessary to do that is to have data about infection rates. So we have some of that from the plots, but in many areas we don't. So you start with a 100-tree survey, and you survey all mature 100 trees to get an infection rate, and if the infection rate is high enough, it means you can identify trees that you think appear to be resistant to rust. So the higher the infection, the presumably higher likelihood that you'll be able to find that some resistant trees in a stand. So this is a stand in North Jasper, and it's actually quite infected. It doesn't look so from here, The number of cankers is not high, but most of the trees are infected. Next slide. So once you identify those resistant trees, and we have several hundred in Jasper that we're watching, and a subset of those are high quality, where we have them in resistance testing programs. I think we have about 50 or so in programs, but we have many that we're watching over time because we think they may be resistant. But it's really important to keep those trees alive. And this became really critical in the last 10 years when Jasper faced a pretty severe outbreak of mountain pine beetle. About 50% of the forests in the park were killed by mountain pine beetle, and the beetle went up into high elevation. So for about 5 years, we applied verbenone and greenleaf volatiles to every one of our identified resistant trees. And then we did a study to see how effective that was. And we found that we were able to reduce the probability of attack by 40 to 60%, depending on the DBH of trees. We did lose quite a number of resistant trees, about 40, but we were able to keep many more alive that would have died. And many stands were impacted by beetle during that period. Next slide. Next step is to collect that seed from the resistant trees. So this is Nick, who works here, collecting near the Columbia ice fields. So we focus on years of high cone crops. We protect the seed with cages, of course, like everyone else, and then come back in the fall and pick the cones. Next slide. And then we grow seedlings. So that bun rack is the drying rack for our cones. I think that was last year when we had a lower cone crop. We work with private nurseries to grow seedlings every year. And then next slide. And then we plant annually 2-year-old seedlings. And ideally, we try and find areas that were previously burned. This is a 20-year-old burn, and we plant in microsites based on some research I think that Cyndi talked about from Waterton that demonstrated that microsites increase survival. Next slide. And then we plant a lot of seedlings. So these are some rough numbers. They're out of date already from Canada. 250, probably closer to 300,000 now. Jody would have a better sense of the numbers. But across the range, we're gaining more and more momentum, more capacity to plant seedlings. Next slide. And then we plant those seedlings in a lot of places. So you can see where Cyndi and I are in the range, and all of the purple dots are locations of seedling planting. And I know I'm missing some up near Smithers. But it gives you a rough idea that we're planting really across the range, in some areas more than others. Next slide. And then I'll run through these next 8 steps pretty quickly because they're at a bit higher level, but completely so critical to the success of the program. So resistance testing is now underway in British Columbia. So that's new in the last 5 or 6 years that we have capacity in Canada, which is great. And then over the last few years, many people have really focused hard on getting seed orchards and clone banks in place, led by the foundation, working with BC and other partners. We have Whitebark Pine seed orchards in BC, and we have a limber pine orchard in Waterton. And then restoration plans. This is earlier days to get the restoration plans following the Crown of the Continent model. I don't know if many of you have seen that paper that was published in the last year about the Crown of the Continent restoration plan, but our plan is to follow that model in Canada. Next slide. moving back down to things that are happening in the field. The next step is to reduce competition and improve the seedbed, especially around resistant trees. At least for us in our area, that's where we've focused more. I know there's been a lot more mechanical thinning work done in other areas. That's not been a particular focus of us. We've focused more on areas around resistant trees. Next slide. And the use of prescribed fire. We are thinking increasingly about the use of prescribed fire and helping to prepare areas for planting. So it's a direction that we'd like to go in more. In Jasper, we had a pretty severe wildfire that actually burned into the middle of October, which is really unusual for us. So fire is really changing with climate change as well, and so that introduces new complexities. Next slide. And then celebrate successes, and I think that's just really important. You know, we've made a ton of progress in the last 20 years, and it's really important to remember that, you know, it's a lot of collective efforts have made this change happen. And so, you know, I think it's important to pause and reflect on all of that good work that so many people have done. Next slide. And one of the other focuses that we've had in the national parks and others is to inspire others to help. So this film, it's just over 5 minutes. It's on YouTube, produced by Parks Canada, called Planting the Future, Saving Whitebark and Limber Pine. It's a fabulous film made by a Canmore filmmaker, and it's beautiful. It's really beautiful and inspiring little piece. And then last slide. So where to from here? You know, we just had a meeting last week in Banff with many partners from across Canada, and what I was blown away by is just how much momentum there is in BC and in Alberta to continue to work and do a lot of the hard work of the planning and the hard work on the ground to make change happen. That's my last slide. Cyndi, you're muted. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, thank you both for an excellent talk, and we can definitely transition to questions. So just as a reminder, people are welcome to type in their questions in the chat box, or if you do want to speak, you can virtually raise your hand and I will unmute you. So I think we have already some questions in the chat box, and I think the first question is from John Van Gundy. He asked, can pile seeds overwinter on the tree and still be viable for germination?
Basically, no, I don't think. I mean, they don't last, at least up in our area. We actually have some concerns over the few, southern Alberta, southeastern BC, so few mature cone-bearing whitebark pine in particular, but also limber pine, that the predators are actually getting at them before they can be dispersed, and they're eating them because they don't have enough of a food source. So maybe others have a thought on that, but generally I don't think they would last the winter and be viable the next year.
Great, thanks. And then I see one more question from John Van Gundy. He asked, at what altitude and aspect are the Whitebark pine seed orchards that you guys mentioned?
Oh, that's a good question that I can't answer, but I can find the answer, and I'd be happy to share. I think there's a report that I can get my hands on, so if I can get your email, then I can forward that to you.
Great. Yeah, I can send you, Brenda, I think John's email for that.
Right, maybe Jody will jump in on the chat, and I think she may have a better idea of those elevations.
Oh, good one,
Watch
Cyndi.
the chat as well.
Yeah, great. And then I think another question is, and I think I'm gonna mispronounce this name, might be from Mojde. They're wondering, are there any concerns that the resistant trees may have ecologically unfavorable genetic traits for the new environments they are planted in?
So this isn't my area of expertise, and I'm trying to channel Jody Kurkowski and what she would say about seed transfer guidelines. And so I will just say that we're guided by these seed transfer guidelines to help us improve the chances that where we plant the seedlings, that they'll have a good match.
Great. I think we have another question potentially from Richard Sneesko. I see his hand is raised, so I've now let Richard, you should be able to speak.
Just maybe on that issue, I think if you make many selections for resistance, incorporate genetic diversity, obviously those trees are currently adapted to where they're growing. So I think the key is to keep as much genetic diversity in your population you can as you select for resistance. So that, just to add to what Brenda was saying.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question from Joe Buck. His question is, what are the greatest bottlenecks and issues preventing growing out seedlings for outplanting?
Oh, I think that varies depending on where your land base is, what some of your key challenges would be. I mean, there's logistical challenges, and maybe that's not quite the question you're asking. But so I'll talk about the logistical challenges working in Jasper, and that's finding good plantable areas. For us, that's one of the most difficult things. That's why we're looking at using prescribed fire to help create good plantable areas. So, it definitely creates an issue for us, and that's one of the solutions we found. And maybe I'll open it up to others to talk about, to try and maybe answer your question more specifically.
Certainly down in Waterton, one of the issues we're facing always is in that area, there's also bear grass, and bear grass outcompetes and is very difficult to try to do any planting where there's bear grass. And so that was certainly one of the issues. And I think, and people like Rebecca Lawrence could talk more on it, but just the fact that these seedlings are in this cone and the roots and so on are quite entangled, making sure that those roots can have room to expand in the hole that you're digging can be difficult as well. And just the seasonality. I mean, some of these sites are getting drier and drier. You try to plant maybe in the fall when there's going to be, there's going to be some moisture over the winter, and then you get a year like this year where it was hot and dry into late October, and yet you've had scheduled planting earlier than that. So those are a few issues that we've run into, and everybody has probably different issues depending on their microhabitats and elevation.
Yeah. Great, thanks. Another question from Lucetta Sims. She said, we have documented whitebark pine growing the Trinity Alps at 5,500 feet elevation. Does it typically grow that low in elevation across its range, or have you seen that in your field outings?
I think it's quite variable. As you go further south, you're going to get some really high elevation places, but some lower. Jody, I see in the chat there mentioned there's some 900 meter sites in northern BC where overall the tree line is lower. So that has an impact on where these species grow as well. So it's quite variable. And, you know, the numbers I gave was more kind of for the central Canadian Rockies here, where we find them in those elevational ranges, but they're certainly quite variable across the range. Probably kind of similar at a similar latitude, but again, microhabitat has a lot, or aspect, and slope has a lot of effect on that, on elevational range.
Mhm. Thank you. Another, I think it's a clarification question from Karina Strauss. Is your info about planted trees from Parks Canada only, or is it also with planting by all whitebark efforts in Canada, I'm assuming?
So that table is all whitebark efforts, but it is from last year. And if I don't know whether Jody added anything in the link, but it reflects up to last year. And I'd sure be curious about what the numbers are like in the US. I'm sure much higher, but you know, this is sans probably, oh, I forget when Cyndi said they started in Waterton, but you know, it's definitely more recent, and we're just the momentum is growing. So as we become more experienced, we're increasing every year.
Mm-hmm. Great. We have another, I think, question or potentially comment from Charlie Cartwright, who's raised their hand. And oh wait, oops. Okay, I think Charlie, you should be able to talk now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we've got 12 seed transfer trials planted across the range in BC. There's also one in Alberta, one in Washington State, and one in Oregon. So we have a pretty good network of sites to look at seed transfer. These will also give us information on trait durability, as we intend to keep these over the life of the trees. And also you get to compare the rust resistance as it occurs across different types of sites. As to our seed orchards, there's one in Prince George at about 800 meters. There's another one in southern BC near the, well, at about 50 degrees at 1,300 meters. We proposed a couple others in northern BC. There's a zone in which they grow consistently between 800 and 1,000 meters, and an orchard for that might be in order. I think that covers those questions.
Thanks, Charlie. That's great.
Yeah. Thanks. I think we have another question from Joe Buck. This question is, what's the guidance on years post-burn prior to planting seedlings?
You know, here, in my experience, it depends a lot on the severity of the burn. We have a burn from 2005 that there's still just nothing. There's nothing growing. It's just really harsh. Whereas the one, I think I had a little picture of a microsite of a similarly aged burn that's a little bit closer to the Continental Divide, more veg, and it was ready. So really what it comes down to is we have planting plans, we do the recon, and we identify that we've got a good site, and do some test digging, and then follow the planting guidelines. Actually, it's I can't remember what year that little paper, I think it's in Nutcracker Notes, and we've adapted those guidelines for here. So I don't know, somebody else out there might know if there's sort of a sweet spot post fire. But we just go and explore, and we identify which of these burns are suitable.
Yeah, maybe Rebecca in Glacier might have some comment on that, either in the chat or raising her hand. But I think some of it also, and I think Rebecca referred to this earlier, that a lot of this is access. Can you get to the site to plant, to continue monitoring? If it's in a really remote location that you're having to rely on helicopters to come and go, it just gets logistically harder. So you know, I think there's that aspect to the planting and to assessing the burns as well.
Great, thanks. Another question is from Chris Clark, who's asked, do you support daylighting, so clearing subalpine for competition around mature whitebark pine to favor survival and or regeneration?
We did a little bit of that in Waterton, more of an experimental area with experimental thing with using a Terra torch to kind of mimic a intense wildfire that would be in the area and had protected the plus trees and the mature trees there. Again, that's not a big viable option in the national park. And, you know, I think that's not as high on the things we can do compared to other things like the prescribed fire. Maybe Brenda has other thoughts on that, but I mean, it's a good idea in some areas, and it's helpful, and daylighting to just allow some of these seedlings to grow faster. Bob Keane did a lot of work on that, but it's not it's effort intensive, and we don't always have the funding for that kind of effort.
Okay.
We're also doing some of that daylighting as a way to protect resistant trees during wildfire. So if it means, if it's possible to, if extra protection measures can be taken to protect resistant trees during the fire. So that would be another advantage to clearing around resistant trees.
Great, thank you. Another comment from the audience is from Andrea Pip. I think she said, I guess I need a clarification. It was said that the seeds would not overwinter. Cones normally would rot to release seeds. Wouldn't seeds have a long viability?
Well, I think the seeds themselves can be viable, but they don't stay on the tree. So then they're just, you know, if you can store them, collect and store them, then I think Jody's got some numbers in there about how long they can last, and they can be viable, and you can germinate them, you know, 5, 6, 7 years. And you know, Diana and some of her students had found that in the Yellowstone burn, that some of those seeds that were planted by the nutcrackers, you know, majority of them, you know, germinated in the first year after the fire. But then after that, they taper off quickly. But there were some that I think were even out 5, 6 more years that you'd still get a few germinates happening. So I think the issue is between whether, if you collect them and store them properly, they can be viable for quite a while, although, you know, maybe Richard has other comments on that too. But, you know, the limber pine, they open, so those seeds are falling to the ground, and they're less likely to be, again, nutcrackers are also one of the major dispersers of limber pine seeds, even though those cones open on the tree, whereas whitebark, again, they get hammered by the nutcrackers, and they have to disperse the seeds.
Great. Well, thanks for the clarification. I think we have just a couple more questions in the chat. Another one from Richard Sneezko, where he asked, what is your survival 5 years post-planting and like general cause of mortality?
So we have seedling monitoring plots across all of the national park planting sites, and I think also in some of the BC and Alberta ones too. And so we go back at 2 and 5 years, but that's as long as we've been going back. And we're in the neighborhood of 50%. And in early days, honestly, the biggest cause of mortality was, I think, poor planting. And so seedlings were being frost heaved out of the ground, and so that really led us to focus on planting, on improved planting, and bringing in more tree planting experts who had experience planting whitebark pine. And so, you know, early days, that's where we were seeing the problems. We've I I think, improved in that area. And, you know, I'll be really interested to go back in a couple of years in this fall planting and see whether we had a drought this fall, and to see whether we saw poorer survival.
And I see one of the questions on there about microsite criteria, and I think if you go and check in some of those older or some of the Nutcracker notes that you will, you can access on the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation website, you'll find a lot of planting guidelines, early work that was done by Ward and Glenda. Glenda Scott and Ward McCoy are on there, and there's more recent work, Kay Isler's work from, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so, that had gone back and looked at a whole lot of planting sites and tried to tease apart some of that and make recommendations. So I think if you Google around a little, you'll be able to find quite a lot of information on what's been working in certain areas. Because it is site dependent a lot. I mean, there's some clues, like Brenda said, make sure the hole's big enough, and you have, shelter such as rocks or trees that can help protect those seedlings. So there's some basics like that, but there are a lot of other criteria that can help as well. Avoiding frost pockets, things like that.
Great. Well, I think we have just one last question that I'm seeing, and it's from Russell Oakes, wondering if you have any animal damage problems with planted seedlings.
I don't think we've had a lot. I know people who've done direct seeding, which can be cheaper, but it's trade-offs over germination and survival. Lots of times ground squirrels red squirrels have come and dug those up as well, but I don't think we've had much animal damage. I would like to, while I have the opportunity, is thank all the people who've been commenting in the chat box and filling in the blanks for us and updating things, Diana and Jody in particular, and Rich and others.
Yeah, thank you. I guess it's a bit past 1 o'clock. So thank you both again, Cyndi and Brenda, for the excellent talk. And thank you to the audience for participating. Our next webinar will be on December 20th, where we'll be having Laurel Sindewald presenting on the application of high-resolution WorldView 3 satellite imagery to distinguish limber pine from major tree-line vegetation species in Rocky Mountain National Park. So with that, thanks again, everyone, for attending, and hope to see you all next month.